I nearly dropped my coffee when I pulled into my driveway that Tuesday morning. There, rumbling like beasts from a forgotten battlefield, sat 3 massive military tanks, their gun barrels aimed squarely at my front door. My car jolted to a stop, and for a long moment, I just stared. This had to be a prank. A movie set. Something. But the engines idled, the exhaust plumed, and the metal glistened in the early sunlight. This was real. My driveway, my suburban, HOA micromanaged driveway, had become a war zone. I threw the car into park and scrambled out, heart pounding in my chest, still wearing wrinkled pajama pants and a college t-shirt with a coffee stain on the sleeve. My slippers slapped against the pavement as I approached one of the tanks, running my hand along its cold, dust-caked surface. It was solid. Heavy. Absolutely, terrifyingly real. My neighbor's sprinklers hissed nearby. Birds chirped like nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. A soft cough behind me froze me in place. I turned to find Elaine Thompson standing on my perfectly manicured lawn, clipboard pressed to her chest, pearls around her neck gleaming in the morning light. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile you give a bug before you squash it. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, glancing at her watch like this was the most routine Tuesday in history. "I see you've noticed our new enforcement measures." I stared at her, open-mouthed. "Elaine, what the hell is this?" I waved an arm toward the tanks, half expecting her to start laughing and tell me it was all a joke. Section 7.4.2 of the Pinehurst Gardens Homeowners Association bylaws clearly states that all exterior decorations must be approved by the Architectural Committee, she recited smoothly, like she was reading off a courtroom transcript. "What exterior decorations?" Elaine pointed with her pen toward my front yard. Bright balloons still hung from the oak tree, and a cheerful birthday banner fluttered in the light breeze. "Those unauthorized items were installed yesterday at approximately 4:37 p.m., she continued, flipping through her clipboard. I nearly laughed. "Those are for my daughter's birthday party this weekend. They'll be down by Monday." "Rules are rules, Ethan," she cooed, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "The violation comes with a $2,500 fine, effective immediately. Until it's paid, the tanks stay." "You can't be serious," I said, my voice cracking. But looking into Elaine's cold, satisfied eyes, I realized, she absolutely was. I stood frozen in my driveway, the weight of the absurdity pressing down on me. 3 tanks. A $2,500 fine. Balloons. The ridiculousness of it all would have been hilarious if it weren't real. I pulled out my phone, fingers trembling, and before I could dial anyone, a low thrum filled the air. The birds stopped chirping. My neighbors began stepping out onto their porches, shielding their eyes against the bright morning sun. Overhead, the distinct chop of helicopter blades grew louder. I didn't need to look at my phone to know who it was. My father never traveled lightly. The military helicopter descended onto the community park across the street, sending loose leaves and lawn decorations swirling into the air. Car alarms chirped in protest. My neighbors gathered on sidewalks, murmuring and pointing. Out stepped Lieutenant General Robert Harrington, crisp in his uniform, 3 gleaming stars on his shoulders. He didn't come alone. 5 military police officers followed behind him, flanking a woman in a colonel's uniform. They moved as one, their boots crunching across the grass, commanding instant silence. My dad's eyes swept over the scene, from the tanks in my driveway to the crowd of gawking neighbors, finally resting on me, pajama pants, stained shirt, and all. He gave me a quick hug and leaned in close. "Interesting welcome committee you've arranged." "Not my doing," I muttered, embarrassment and relief crashing together in my chest. "Colonel Miller," he called over his shoulder. "Take a look at these vehicles." The female colonel approached the nearest tank, circling it with professional ease. She examined the serial number, running a finger over the engraving. M60 Patton, she announced. Decommissioned, but this one's not properly demilitarized. Serial number matches a vehicle reported missing from Fort Benning's surplus yard yesterday. The murmurs in the crowd turned to audible gasps. Elaine, who'd been hanging back, finally stepped forward, her clipboard clutched so tightly I thought it might snap in two. What's going on here? This is private HOA business. My father turned slowly, his presence heavy and calm. I'm Lieutenant General Robert Harrington, United States Army. And you are? Elaine straightened her spine. Elaine Thompson, President of the Pinehurst Gardens Homeowners Association. My father nodded once, expression unreadable. These vehicles, Mrs. Thompson, were they acquired through official government channels? Elaine's eyes flickered for the first time. They were obtained through surplus auction. My cousin Marcus facilitated the purchase. Interesting, my father replied evenly. Because according to Colonel Miller, these vehicles matched the description of property stolen from Fort Benning just yesterday. Property that never went to auction. That's impossible, Elaine sputtered. My father's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and then back at Elaine. Marcus Reynolds is currently being questioned by federal investigators. Theft of government property is a serious federal offense, Mrs. Thompson. A silence settled over the street. Tom Carter appeared beside me, his expression grim but satisfied. I thought I'd seen Elaine lose control before, but now the cracks were showing. We're willing to cooperate fully, Elaine stammered, her tone shifting to desperate politeness. If these vehicles are indeed government property, we will of course remove them immediately. How generous, my father said dryly. Colonel Miller, please arrange for transport. The colonel stepped aside to make the call. My father turned to the crowd, addressing the neighbors in a voice that carried authority and calm. While we wait, perhaps some of you would like to share your experiences with this HOA's enforcement policies? It was like opening a floodgate. They fined me $1,000 for planting petunias in the front yard. Someone shouted from the crowd. My fence was 2 inches too high, they charged me $400 a day until I tore it down. They towed my son's car from our driveway because of a bumper sticker they didn't like. Elaine tried to retake control, raising her hands. These are all violations according to our community standards, which everyone agreed to follow when they bought property here. Actually, Judge Warren's voice cut through the chaos, many of those so-called violations aren't even in the original bylaws. The board has been adding new rules without homeowner votes. He stepped forward with Tom, holding up a laptop. We've documented the last 3 years of rule changes, and financial records. More gasps. Phones came out. Cameras rolled. Sandra Hayes pushed through the crowd, her voice steady but fierce. The HOA collected $37,500 in violation fines last month alone. Only $3,200 shows in the official accounts. The rest? Missing. Elaine's face drained of color. Her husband Douglas stepped forward, blustering. This is harassment. We have the right to enforce standards. Not with stolen military property, my father said evenly. And not with fraudulent financial practices. At that moment, a black SUV pulled up, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, flashing a badge. Mrs. Thompson, I'm Special Agent Scott Reeves with the FBI. We need to ask you some questions. Elaine's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her clipboard slipped from her hands, landing on the grass with a soft thud. As she was led to the waiting vehicle, neighbors whispered, pointed, and filmed. Tom turned to me, his eyes burning with satisfaction. We might actually win this. I wanted to believe him. But as I watched Douglas Thompson slip through the crowd, whispering urgently to clusters of worried-looking neighbors, I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, the storm hit. Not the kind with thunder and rain, but one made of fear, confusion, and paperwork. At exactly 7 a.m., 3 white vans from the county inspector's office rolled into Pinehurst Gardens. Their doors swung open with military precision, and a dozen officials in county uniform spread out like vultures circling a dying animal. I watched from my kitchen window, coffee cooling in my hand, as the first bright red notice was slapped onto the Petersons' front door across the street. Michael Peterson stumbled onto his porch in his robe, clutching the paper in shaking hands. Unauthorized structure. Demolition required within 30 days. His voice cracked as he shouted at the inspector, waving an official HOA approval letter. The inspector didn't even look up. HOA approval isn't county approval, sir. Someone filed an anonymous complaint. I didn't need 3 guesses. I bolted outside just in time to see another inspector taping a violation notice to the Rodriguez family's garage door. Their handicap ramp, the one they built for Mrs. Ramirez's elderly mother, was suddenly deemed unsafe and ordered removed. Catherine Brooks, another neighbor, ran down the street in tears, clutching a citation for her backyard deck, a deck they'd used to host neighborhood barbecues for years. By noon, 5 homes had received demolition orders, and another 12 were slapped with massive fines. Every fence too tall, every shed too close to a property line, every garden bed not on an approved plan, all suddenly illegal. My neighbors, once united and defiant, were now gathering in small, nervous clusters, whispering and panicking. You poked the bear, Catherine hissed at me, her mascara running down her cheeks. $8,000 in fines. We were fine before you started this war. I wanted to argue, to remind them that Elaine's corruption couldn't be allowed to continue, but the words stuck in my throat as I watched the Rodriguez family carrying their grandmother down their front steps, tears in their eyes, because they could no longer safely use the ramp that had given her freedom. Tom Carter appeared at my side, his face grim. We've got trouble, Ethan. The county inspectors aren't just enforcing minor code violations, they're working off a master list. I've seen the pattern before. Elaine's doing this. My phone buzzed. A notification from the county tax office. You are under investigation for filing fraudulent property documents regarding your garage extension. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Before I could react, Tom grabbed my arm and pulled me toward his house. In his dining room, he pulled up a series of emails on his laptop, his voice low and furious. She forged documents in your name. Submitted them to the county to make it look like you lied on your permits. The signature doesn't even match yours, it's a sloppy forgery, but enough to trigger an investigation. I clenched my fists. She's trying to discredit me. Tom nodded. And it's working. The neighbors are scared, Ethan. They're starting to blame you. The doorbell rang. I opened it to find Michael Peterson standing there, his face pale. I'm sorry, Ethan. I can't be part of this anymore. I need to protect my family. He handed me a stack of papers, copies of the financial records we'd gathered, and shook his head. We're pulling out of the group. We're going to pay the fines and try to stay under the radar. He wasn't the only one. One by one, neighbors came by with apologies, excuses, and fearful glances. People I thought would stand with me were slipping away. That night, I called an emergency meeting in my living room. Only a handful showed up: Tom, Mrs. Morgan, Judge Warren, and the Rodriguez family. The others had either folded or gone quiet. Mrs. Morgan's voice was heavy with worry. We've discovered something else. She spread out papers across my dining table, county records, old permits, and architectural maps. Pinehurst Gardens was built on old wetlands. The developer cut corners, bribed inspectors, and got sign-off on faulty foundations. When the fraud was discovered, the developer transferred everything to the HOA, making us, the homeowners, liable for all structural problems. My head spun. So even if we fix the fines, the houses themselves are at risk? Worse than that, she whispered. We're sitting on a massive freshwater spring. If it's confirmed, the county will condemn every house in the neighborhood to protect the water source. Tom leaned forward. Elaine isn't just covering her tracks. She's helping Clearwater Development push everyone out. They want the water. A knock at the door startled us. I opened it to find a small, unmarked envelope on the doorstep. Inside was a detailed map of Pinehurst Gardens, red circles around dozens of properties, including mine. A sticky note in tight handwriting, "You're next. E." I looked up to see a black SUV pulling away down the street. My stomach turned to ice. We need to fight this, I said, trying to rally the group. If we expose the spring and the corruption behind it, they won't be able to get away with this. Mrs. Morgan shook her head. They've planned this too well. And Elaine, she's not finished. Tom's laptop chimed with a new message. An anonymous tip: county inspectors were already planning to return the next morning. They were coming for my house. And this time, they weren't just bringing notices. They were bringing bulldozers. The night felt endless. Sleep was impossible with the weight of threats pressing down on me from every direction. Each creak of the floorboards made me sit up, heart racing, half expecting another inspector's notice or some new escalation. At 2 a.m., I found myself back at the dining table with Tom, Mrs. Morgan, and Judge Warren, maps and documents scattered across every surface. The deeper we dug, the uglier it became. Clearwater Development hadn't just stumbled upon an opportunity. They had orchestrated this entire scheme from the beginning. The original builder had known about the freshwater spring underneath Pinehurst Gardens but concealed it, cutting corners on drainage and foundation work, bribing county officials to look the other way. Once the defects were too obvious to hide, they handed everything off to the HOA, leaving homeowners trapped with the legal responsibility. And now, with Elaine acting as their enforcer, they planned to trigger a wave of code enforcement, foreclosures, and demolitions, then swoop in and reclaim the land for pennies, all to bottle and sell the pristine water beneath our feet. But Elaine's arrogance had given us one advantage: she kept everything. Tom leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. There's one place she keeps her personal files, he said quietly. The old community clubhouse. No one uses it anymore, but Elaine's had a key. I bet that's where the smoking gun is. I grabbed my jacket without hesitation. The rain started as a drizzle and quickly turned into a cold downpour, soaking through my clothes as I sped across the neighborhood. The old clubhouse sat at the far edge of the community, dark and forgotten, its paint peeling, the windows clouded with dust. The lock on the door was old and flimsy. A few careful twists with a flathead screwdriver, and it popped open. The room smelled like mildew and old paper. Boxes of records were stacked high along the walls. But one filing cabinet near the back looked newer, the metal still shiny beneath the dust. I tugged at the drawer, locked. Looking for these? Her voice made me spin around. Elaine stood in the doorway, rain dripping from her expensive trench coat, her makeup running slightly but her eyes still sharp and cold. In her hand was a thick folder, and for the first time, her face showed no smug satisfaction. Just exhaustion. How much are they paying you to destroy this neighborhood? I asked, my voice low and steady. $5 million, she said simply. Enough to disappear. My stomach twisted. You live here too? Not for long, she replied. Clearwater wired the first installment this morning. All I have to do is deliver proof that the spring is real and watch the county do the rest. She tossed the folder onto the table between us. The truth, printed out in bank records, emails, photos, and inspection reports, all of it damning. Why show me this now? Because it's over, she said quietly. The county water inspectors are arriving tomorrow. Once they confirm the spring, it's done. You can fight, scream, call the media, it won't matter. The law will be on their side. I grabbed the folder, flipping through the pages, the scale of corruption leaving me breathless. Clearwater Development had paid off inspectors, county planners, even some state officials. They'd used Elaine as a puppet. But she'd been more than willing to dance on strings for the right price. I should turn this over to the FBI, I said. You should, she agreed. But it won't stop what's coming. They've been planning this for years. I left her standing there and ran back through the rain, clutching the folder like it was a live grenade. At dawn, Judge Warren's living room became a war room. Tom, Mrs. Morgan, the Rodriguez family, and my father gathered around the dining table. My dad's face was grave as he examined the documents. This goes higher than I thought, he said. Clearwater has friends in high places. But that cuts both ways. We can use this. He pulled out his phone. I'm calling in every favor I have. Hours later, 4 military transport vehicles rolled into Pinehurst Gardens again, this time not carrying tanks, but environmental engineers, soil experts, and structural specialists in full uniform. News vans followed, cameras trained on every movement. The county water inspectors arrived in sleek black SUVs, their expressions already smug as they stepped out. But their faces paled as they took in the scene, rows of military personnel, reporters shouting questions, and neighbors holding signs demanding answers. A tall man in an expensive suit emerged from the lead SUV, Clearwater Development's logo gleaming on his briefcase. What is all this? He barked. Mrs. Morgan stepped forward, holding up the folder. We're conducting a comprehensive environmental and structural audit of Pinehurst Gardens. Any attempts to condemn our homes will be met with full legal action and public exposure. His face twisted into a sneer. You have no proof. I held up the folder for the cameras to see. We have every wire transfer, every bribe, every falsified inspection report. Reporters swarmed. Microphones extended. The Clearwater representative's smirk vanished. The standoff lasted for hours. Military engineers took soil samples and verified the spring's presence, all broadcast live. State environmental officials arrived by mid-afternoon, summoned by the media storm. By evening, representatives from the state attorney general's office joined them. My father stood at my side, watching the chaos unfold. You didn't just fight back, son. You forced them into the light. But I knew this wasn't the end. Elaine was gone. The neighborhood was still scared. And Clearwater had deep pockets and deeper influence. This was just the beginning. The fallout came faster than any of us expected. Within 3 weeks, the scandal exploded beyond our quiet streets and into statewide headlines. Clearwater Development's CEO was indicted on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and environmental crimes. 2 county commissioners resigned in disgrace, their ties to bribery and illegal permits laid bare for all to see. The state attorney general announced sweeping investigations into housing developments across the state. For a while, it felt like we had finally won. But victory came with scars. Pinehurst Gardens was left in shambles. Homes needed emergency repairs, drainage systems had to be rebuilt, and foundations reinforced. County inspectors who once doled out fines with glee were replaced by state oversight teams, but the damage had already fractured trust between neighbors. Some homeowners, too frightened or exhausted to fight anymore, sold and moved on. The Jacksons left quietly one night, their windows dark and curtains drawn. The Petersons packed their moving van while neighbors awkwardly avoided their gaze. It wasn't just about homes anymore, it was about betrayal, fear, and uncertainty. Then, when we least expected it, Elaine returned. She stood before the entire community one cold autumn evening, her once pristine image gone. No pearls, no clipboard, just a plain jacket and tired eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, her voice smaller than I had ever heard. "But I'd like to help fix what I helped break." There was silence, broken only by the shuffling of feet and the rustle of papers in the wind. To everyone's surprise, it was Judge Warren who stepped forward first. "You start by telling the truth," he said simply. And she did. Elaine turned over every document, every contact, every hidden detail we hadn't yet uncovered. She named names, exposed deals, and testified against Clearwater Development. The governor himself visited Pinehurst Gardens to announce emergency grants, low-interest loans, and a state-funded initiative to protect the freshwater spring as a community resource. With Elaine's cooperation, and under strict supervision, rebuilding finally began. It wasn't easy. Some wounds ran deep. But as months passed, fences were mended, both literal and figurative. I watched neighbors who once snarled at each other offer helping hands. I saw Michael Bennett, who had once blamed me for everything, stand beside Elaine as they measured lumber for the new community center. We didn't become friends overnight. But we became something stronger, neighbors again. 6 months after that insane morning with tanks in my driveway, I stood with my father in front of the nearly completed community center, built on solid ground, overlooking the crystal-clear spring that had nearly torn us apart. "You know what's funny," Dad said, resting a hand on my shoulder. "The tanks came here to enforce ridiculous rules. But in the end, they forced out the truth instead." I smiled, watching children race down the newly paved sidewalks, their parents chatting without fear. And as I looked around, at the walls we raised together, the bridges we rebuilt, and even at Elaine, now measuring garden beds alongside Mrs. Morgan, I realized that the hardest battle isn't against greed or corruption. It's against hopelessness. We won, not because we crushed an enemy, but because we rebuilt something worth protecting. Now, the tanks are gone, but the lessons they left behind will stay forever. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA rules, or a Karen's impossible demands? Share your stories below. Let's see who had it worse.